Welcome to this presentation on disabled group housing. Disabled group housing is an investment in people, communities, and society. My name is Jason Howell. I'm Executive Director of a nonprofit called Soberhood, as well as the Texas Recovery-Oriented Housing Network project. The objectives of this presentation is to gain an understanding of group housing and why it's needed, to understand the far-reaching benefits to not only disabled individuals but their families, community, and to society as a whole, to understand that different people have different group housing needs and or at different points in their life, to answer frequently asked questions, and to understand how you can help. To get an understanding of a general definition of what group housing is, let's use the definition. It's a living arrangement where several unrelated individuals who are disabled receive support services along with housing in a single dwelling. It's important to note that there's a shortage of disabled group housing, and this is because there's a lack of affordable housing in competitive markets in general. There's also a lack of financial resources. People with disabilities often don't make a lot of money and may not have all the financial resources available to them that other populations do. And they also battle with a lot of stigma and discrimination. It takes a village to run most of these group houses. You have the residents themselves. There is typically a house manager, which either could be a resident peer or a professional staff member. Depending on the house model, the manager could stay overnight or it could be staffed 24/7. There's also the housing provider, which is typically a nonprofit or it could be a for-profit entity. And they rent these properties from landlords. So you have landlords in the picture. And then depending on the housing model and the disabled individual's needs, there could be this whole team of service providers, including case managers, employment services, transportation services, and just in general, a lot of different wraparound services. Disabled individuals often need group housing to receive the support they need, to afford the services they need, and to live a happier, healthier, and more productive life. Group houses have this far-reaching ripple effect because they not only improve the disabled individuals' lives, but in turn it improves families and friends' lives, workplaces' lives, neighborhoods' lives, and society as a whole. It generates cost savings because group housing cost-effectively provides services. They efficiently match service levels with service needs, and they reduce, delay, or in some cases completely eliminate the need for costly services. One size definitely doesn't fit all because there's so many different types of disabilities. In general, we can talk about them in this, disabilities as physical, mental, and developmental disabilities. But we should also specifically look at substance use disorder, which is a chronic mental illness and a disability that's found kind of across the board. People with disabilities are at higher risk for substance use disorder than the general population. There are a lot of different populations with a lot of different needs, and that's the reason we need so many different types of group housing models. There could be a house that's specifically developed for particular co-occurring disabilities and or chronic illnesses. There's different degrees of disabilities or a stage of someone's chronic illness. Not everybody wants recovery, so you really have to build a house around the individual's goals or their desires. There could be a house specifically, built around either for men or for women, maybe transgenders, for the young, for the old, or perhaps a house for women and children. There could be a house specifically built for veterans, for gay and lesbians, for the reentry population, or for the homeless. And there are oftentimes housing models that are built around specific housing resources or financial resources are more like financial limitations. There's lots of different types of housing models out there that would fit under the umbrella of disabled group housing. Being able to distinguish one from the other is a whole art to itself, but you'd likely see different names like boarding home, board and care home, enriched housing, therapeutic community, assisted living home, a foster home, a transitional house, a faith-based house, sober living house, clean and sober home, a recovery residence, or a halfway house, three-quarter house, or quarter house. It's important to know that these all generally fit under the disabled group housing and each serve a different population. Even when we look at a very specific disability like substance use disorder, you see that there's a need for this spectrum of housing models, anywhere from transitional and temporary housing to group housing like what we're talking about, as well as other housing plus service models like permanent supportive housing and public housing at large. I get a lot of frequently asked questions. One is around property value and how does group housing impact property value? And according to the Council of Planning Librarians, when they looked at over 50 studies, they really have no effect on property value. Sure, we can find a bad apple here and there, but in a meta-analysis, on aggregate, on average, across years, across thousands of houses and thousands of lives, it really doesn't impact property value. A lot of people are concerned that it's going to impact neighborhood safety. This is not true. According to the Illinois Planning Council on Developmental Disabilities. And that may seem real far away in Illinois, so let's take a look at Austin. If we looked at 25 Austin sober houses and looked up their crime data from 2001 using crimelab.com, we would find that there were 2 minor reports and 0 arrests. This clearly is not, they're not having an impact on neighborhood safety or crime. There's also this misconception that disabled group housing are cash cows and people are doing this for the money, quote unquote. Actually, it's a labor of love, not for profits. And this is because there's limited revenue. Residents typically have low income and low access to financial resources. And houses have to deal with variable occupancy rates. And there are high costs, high startup costs, you have working capital cost, overhead costs, staffing costs, and depending on the population, and a lot of them have really high needs, there's this wraparound service cost. You've got to maintain the house, and you've got to continually market so you can maximize the occupancy. There's also this conception that we need regulation to improve the quality and accessibility of disabled group housing, and that's absolutely false because regulation will throw the disabled baby out with the bathwater. Regulation would be unfunded mandates that would reduce service quality, reduce the number of available houses, especially for the fragile populations, the populations that are already being underserved, and it will result in discrimination. If you notice who's proposing most of the regulation, it's not in my backyard groups rather than advocates for persons with disabilities. So there's a lot of discrimination and stigma that is driving a lot of the concepts around regulation. So what are the kind of oversights, the laws that we should be taking a look at in regards to disabled group housing? And probably the foremost is that disabled group housing is federally protected. It's protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act as well as the Fair Housing Act and through lots and lots of case law. Oftentimes states may look to regulate disabled group housing, but that regulation is really limited by the federal fair housing rights. They can regulate them on fire and safety codes, and they do regulate the professional and clinical services that are provided within the homes. Most often, you find that it's the local city county that are trying to pass land use ordinances to restrict disabled group housing from moving into a certain neighborhood, and that's clearly illegal, and it's limited by fair housing rights. So what's the answer when it comes to oversight? And I would say that carrots work better than sticks. There's always the power of the purse, especially when these houses are, working on very thin margins. Government funders and their standards have great influence over how these houses are run, and nonprofit funding can have a great influence on houses as well. In order to get this funding, a particular house needs to meet a certain set of standards. So this is a win-win situation. The other thing that we're trying to do here with the Recovery-Oriented Housing Network is distinguish the good providers. We want to develop housing standards and then develop an accreditation and certification process that really distinguishes those good providers. So they're, being more profitable, and then that encourages them to open more homes. So how can you help? Well, you can become an advocate for disabled rights, an advocate for housing rights, and you can encourage housing providers to join the Texas Recovery Oriented Housing Network. You can support housing through nonprofits. You can either donate or fundraise. Nonprofits definitely need fundraisers so they can help more people. And there's tons of volunteering opportunities. And probably, leave with the concept of being a good neighbor. I can guarantee you that people running and living in a disabled group housing are more afraid of you than you are of them. So reach out, meet the housing management, exchange contact information, maybe even work together on a neighborhood project.